Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with a first impressions video of the Mosquito B Mark VI in DCS. Now, if you're like me, your very first impression when you look at this cockpit is, holy crap, there's a lot of stuff going on in here. So let's do a quick cockpit tour and maybe demystify things a little bit. The first thing to remember about the Mosquito is that it is a little bit of airplane wrapped around a whole lot of engine. So, like a lot of warbirds, care and feeding of your power plant is going to feature strongly in your cockpit routine. And once we have the lights on here, and they're up here almost under the dash on the left here, we can see that the left-hand side of the pilot station is devoted to the engine controls and gauges. The difference here is, first of all, that there are two engines, each of which has its own control and its own gauges. But second of all, both engines have separate power and RPM controls that do need to be managed separately. This is at least partly because at sea level, the Mosquito absolutely has more power than it needs, so you can't just open the throttle to the firewall and point it at the enemy. You will need to watch the separate gauges for both engines, for both boost and RPM levels, and you will need to bind controls that separately control these for each engine, which means that you will likely run out of axes on your joystick or HOTAS in a hurry. In the end, I opted to bind the two halves of my Warthog throttle to one to each of the engine throttles and the slider on the side of the Warthog to the combined propeller axis. I also bound one of my buttons on my joystick to the propeller increase-decrease controls so I could make quick adjustments while I was maneuvering. Once you've gotten past the engine instruments, the other instruments are fairly familiar, with an altimeter and a British-style multi-scale airspeed indicator. The various British attitude and turn and bank indicators are also present, but they are to one extent or another hidden behind the reflector sight a little. Moving over to the right of the cockpit, you'll notice the levers for the gear flaps and a new one for bomb bay doors. The flap and gear levels have an added level of complexity in that they have safety latches that have to be disengaged before they're moved. And this will be a fact well worth remembering, believe me. Also a single brake lever on the stick. Well, I think it's about time that we got this aircraft off the ground. We can talk a little bit more about it while it's in flight. So one of the things about the Mosquito is that because of those very large engines that do not counter-rotate, you do have the standard problem of dealing with a lot of torque, but because it's not so far out in front of you, it's not quite so much of an issue directionally, but you still get an awful lot of gyroscopic precession, meaning that when you pull back on the stick, you do tend to induce a lot of roll. So one of the things that is absolutely critical to do with the Mosquito is to keep the nose down during the takeoff run, which you saw me struggling to do there. You will find that if you let the nose come up, you will get a lot of roll when you pull up, and in fact, I read something on the Mosquito that said that one of the issues was for inexperienced aircrew, there was a loss of aileron sensitivity at low speeds. This is a fact to which I can personally attest. Okay, so we're climbing out, and as you can see, we've also already reduced power. The recommended climb settings are a boost of around 9 pounds and RPMs of about 2850, which is substantially less than you can achieve at maximum power at takeoff, and it's very important that you scale back to this pretty quickly after takeoff to maintain controllability. It's also very important that you keep the nose down in order to let the aircraft gain speed. You want to get to about 170 miles an hour and then maintain that speed as you climb out. And I find that the Mosquito takes a little while to hit its stride, building up to full power, but once it does, you can actually get some pretty decent climb out of it at 170 miles an hour. Interestingly, compared to other aircraft, I find that it's interesting that at slow speeds, it requires a lot of nose down trim that you then have to back off as the speed builds up, which is kind of the opposite, at least, of most of the aircraft that I fly, so that's interesting. As I said, once it hits its stride, it is actually a pretty substantial climber at cruise speeds. It can manage between 2,500 and 3,000 feet per minute, which is actually pretty impressive. And I attribute that partly to the fact that it is a very light aircraft, again, with a lot of power. So it doesn't feel like it's strongly nose up, but it is getting up there pretty quickly. And it's also, once you've scaled back to that 2850 and 9 pounds of boost, it's actually pretty quiet in the climb, and it's a very comfortable climb. And by the time you get to about 170 knots, I find that or 170 miles an hour, the controls are getting to be nice and light, and there's not a lot of sag. But once if you let the speed drop too far, that reappears. So you definitely want to keep your speed about 170. I'm letting it drop a little here, but about 170 or a little more as you climb. So now that I'm leveling off, I'm going back to the recommended speeds for cruise, which is about 7 pounds of boost and about 2,650 RPM. And as you can see, this is a very comfortable cruise. You can see that the speed is building up. Eyeball flattening acceleration is not, so far as I can tell, one of the things that the Mosquito will be known for. It is fast, but it does take a little while to build itself up to that speed. But you can see we're moving out handsomely here, moving up on pretty close to 240, almost 250 miles an hour. We're going to close the cowl flaps now, just to make things even more efficient. And now let's just see how she does in a dive. So as you can see, the rollover is very smooth. I find I really like the way the aircraft dives. It doesn't mind going into a dive, although it's not begging you to go. But once you get it pointed at a point on the ground, it stays pretty rock solid. And it's gaining speed pretty rapidly, but not overwhelmingly. And then the other thing is, once you get down to the point where you're going to ask it to pull out, it pulls up pretty happily. I don't feel a lot of resistance. As the books say, the controls are pretty light, although I will tell you that I have my elevator curvature set way up, like almost 50%. I find that it's very twitchy in pitch with a standard curve, and that's because it does have a very large elevator. And then now we're doing a little bit of a power climb, so we're pulling it up, getting the climb indicator near the bottom of the instrument there, and I'm just going to let it go until we're almost out of speed, see how high we can pull it up. Now, another thing you need to be aware of is that the aircraft does not like negative G's at all. The Rolls-Royce engines will cut out if you give them any negative G's. So pulling out of a climb is better done by rolling a little and pulling down rather than pushing over the top. So as you can see, we got up to down to around 160 miles an hour, and we got up close to 4,000 feet at the top of that climb, which is not a bad power climb. Not really bad at all. Now, I'm going to go back in the cockpit here, and you'll notice that our eye position has changed. We're looking down the middle of the cockpit through the sight, and that's just because I powered on the reflector sight, which automatically moves you over to this perspective. So from here, let's do a little bit more violent maneuvering. We'll do a little bit of a steeper dive, and we'll get into it this time with a little bit of a wing over. So we'll add some rudder to the bank and let it drop the nose for us, which it does very nicely. And then we'll pull up and aim at that group of buildings down there. And as we do that, we'll pull back on the power, pulling back on the RPMs before we pull back on the boost, which is the recommended procedure. Again, you can see it's very stable in the dive, and it's also very sensitive to the rudder, so we can actually strafe back and forth if we want to with the nose. And it pulls up very mildly at the bottom without a lot of dramatic effects, and lets us go back into a nice steep bank down this river. So we'll do a little bit of river flying here just so we can see what it's like at low level following an actual prescribed course. And again, it doesn't feel like it should be able to get around some of the corners that it does. It does have a very effective rudder, but you have to be very careful about how you use it. I find I want to lead with bank, and then I can use the rudder to control the nose. There's actually a lot of nose control authority, even if I'm not all that well coordinated all the time. I do have a lot of control over which way the nose is pointed, which I suspect would be really useful in a dogfight, for instance. So as you can see, it flies down this river very benignly, very light on the controls, not feeling like I'm struggling to hold it in line or pull it around the corners at all. It's a very pleasant experience flying this aircraft at low level. And it is definitely a stick and rudder experience, unlike a lot of more modern aircraft. The rudder is there for a reason. You don't want to overuse it, but you can use it to do some pretty impressive maneuvering. And in fact, I'm going to do a full wing over here at the top. The plane doesn't really like to go inverted, so instead let's actually do a little bit of a wing over. with the rudder, so we'll wait till we lose a little bit of speed, and then we'll just let the nose come around. I'm really standing on the rudder, letting it rotate, and now continuing the roll through, and then we can pull up and come back straight the way that we were going, and that's a very controllable maneuver. Let's just look at it from the outside, and you can actually see the airplane actually, literally turns around on one wing and then comes back. Now, whereas with a modern fighter, you might do that by rolling over and pulling back through, in the Mosquito, I think you're better to use the rudder. And again, now we're lined up very squarely, very stably. I can, in fact, point the nose right at the top of that building there, and then we'll just clear the top of it. Overall, I think this is going to make the Mosquito a fantastic platform for ground attack, which is, of course, one of the major roles that it filled in the Second World War, and I'm looking forward to wringing it out. Let's do a little bit more of a max rate turn horizontally here. You can see that it can turn very tightly, but it also sacrifices a lot of speed when you put any G-loading on the wings, which I suppose is about what you'd expect. So let's head back down the river now again. Just do a little bit more low-level flying, maybe a little bit less aggressively, just to see how it is flying at low level. Because if you are doing a deep penetration mission, you're going to spend a lot of time down here, just flying along. You can see you get a little bit of oscillation in the nose. That's just me actually on the rudder. It is very sensitive to the rudder, even though I have a lot of curvature built into the rudder. It doesn't take much to get the nose to pay attention. Okay, and now I've turned off the sight, so we're back in the pilot's view. Doing a low-level cruise, let's call it, as we fly along here at a few hundred feet above the countryside. As you can see, we've pulled it back to cruise power, 7 pounds of boost, 2650 on the RPMs, and it's a very pleasant ride. It also sounds absolutely fantastic when it flies by, and I could listen to those flybys all day. So as you can see, it's very responsive. We can get down close to the trees, we can pull over, we can turn up towards that ridge. And I'm not really having any trouble at all flying the contours of the Earth. I don't feel like I'm rushing, I don't feel like I'm fighting the aircraft, and it's not fighting me. Then we can pull up over this ridge and then bank down hard on the other side. I probably could have banked it even a little bit more, gained a little bit more altitude than I wanted there. That's just practice. But the aircraft is very responsive to that. And you can see we lost our speed in that turn, but we pick it up back up, and we're cruising along pretty handsomely at between 260 280 miles an hour in cruise speed, which is a pretty substantial speed for a World War II aircraft, actually. We can go downhill here over the edge of the downs, and then we can add a little power, see what we can do if we really need it to go a little faster. So we pumped it up to about 12 pounds of boost and 3,000 RPM, which is about as high as you want to go without stretching the engines too much. And you can see we're rapidly pulling past the 280 miles an hour, probably headed for around 300, 320 if we go long enough, which is a pretty substantial cruise speed at sea level. The aircraft, I guess, will do much faster than that at high altitude, but of course at high altitude indicated airspeeds are always a little bit higher. So I think your cruise at sea level is going to be something around 290, 300 miles an hour, which is still pretty impressive. Mosquito pilots generally found that unless they were being chased by fighters that started with an advantageous altitude situation, they could basically outrun just about anything almost right up until the end of the war. Some of the very advanced designs of German fighters at the end of the war were able to keep pace with them. But in the 1944, early 45 period, they were basically the fastest thing in the sky in a flat-out flat race. So just pulling up again here, and you can see we climb very pleasantly. I've scaled back now to even a little bit less than climb. I'm more in the cruise power setting. And you just see how easy it is to get back up to altitude. It's really pretty effortless. Now, it's probably about time to start looking around for a place to land. I think I took off from Detling. I think I've gone past Detling, so I'm going to have to turn around But we're just doing some gentle maneuvering here at altitude. And I would certainly agree with the assessment that the aircraft at these kinds of speeds, at these altitudes, very light on the controls. You have a lot of confidence. You don't feel like you're fighting the aircraft. It doesn't feel like it wants to get ahead of you. It's pretty neutrally stable. Responds quickly when you ask it to do things, and doesn't have a lot of bad habits. Even when you add power, you don't get a lot of precession or anything, so long as you're level. So I think Detling is back this way, so we're going to just do a nice slow turn back in this direction. See if we can find the airfield. Of course, one of the really interesting things in the Mosquito, which kind of is obvious, is that the visibility out the nose of the aircraft is great, so we're not going to have any trouble at all picking up the airfield when we see it. That little tone that you heard there is a tone you get if you pull the boost back too far before you drop the landing gear. And I suspect this is going to be one of the enduring things that people remember about the Mosquito. Slowing down without turning that warning horn on is actually going to be something that becomes an art form, I think. The aircraft needs to be slowed down substantially, like below 200 miles an hour before you can even deploy the first level of flaps. But if you pull the boost all the way back, you're going to get that warning horn. So you can pull the RPM back, but it only goes so far. And then I think it's going to be a question of good planning to actually get down to altitude and down to speed to start your approach to the airfield without having to put up with several minutes of having that horn, which is frankly one of the more annoying sounds on the planet. Without having that on for minutes at a time, it's going to take a little bit of planning. So there's Detling just out the left front, and as I can say, easy to see. No problem having to look over a big long nose here. And we're still going pretty fast. I'm concentrating on losing some altitude. I'm hoping that at the bottom of this dive I can pull up, and that will actually help lose some of the added altitude, or some of the speed. And then we're just going to have to bite the bullet and pull back on the power long enough to get the speed down to drop that first level of flaps. So it's very important at this point as you're preparing for landing to remember the latches on the flaps and gear and make sure that you've taken them off, and I have them bound to buttons on my button box. That was one of the first things I did after the first couple of times I tried to do a landing and forgot. Oops, get the seat in the way there. So we're pulling around, pulling up, try and get that speed down, and now we're just going to have to bite the bullet and drop the power. I still find for me at least, landing is a little bit hairy in the Mosquito. It's something I'm just going to have to practice to get good at the sequence of things, because there's a lot of things that you have to do in the right order, managing the power, managing the flaps, the landing gear. Once you're lined up, it's not too bad, but all of this fooling around in the circuit still I find a little bit much. And the other thing to remember about the flaps is that the flaps don't automatically go to a certain notch. You have to put them down and then stop them. Also trying not to let the nose come up too high, which I didn't do very well. But once you've gotten down below 180, then you can drop the gear. And from here on in, getting down to a low enough speed is not going to be a problem. And then once the gear are down, the horn goes off. So now we can kind of relax a little bit. We'll get ourselves lined up on final, and then we'll just drop the flaps and let them go all the way down. So that little transition period where you're trying to get the first row of flaps and get the gear down and get the horn to go off, I still find it's a little bit of task saturation for me. But hopefully that's just something that's going to come with practice. So you can see now that we're on the approach. It's pretty benign, even down at 140 miles an hour, which is kind of where you want to hold it until you're really right at the end of the approach. It's not getting too soggy right now, but you start to feel like the ailerons are needing quite a bit more travel than they used to, and you can see that I'm kind of hunting for the right location here, so I'm still learning. Letting the nose come up to try and kill a little bit more speed. Got the flaps all the way down now. And we're pulling the power back to get ourselves right on the threshold. As you can see, we get a little wobbly here. It's getting a little soggy now, but not too bad. Manage the power. Keep the speed around 120. And we're over the field, so pull the power back. Try and get flared there. Okay, not the greasiest landing in the world, but we're down with only a minor bounce, no major damage to the aircraft, so I think I'll call that successful for our second or third landing in the Mosquito. So, to conclude this video, overall first impressions, I really like the aircraft. It really is an aircraft to warm the cockles of an iron bomber's heart. It's stable in a dive, it points it where you want it to go, carries a lot of variety of ordnance. Apparently it carried rockets, although I'm not sure we've got them in DCS just yet. So I'm really looking forward to ringing it out as an iron bomber. I think that landing and takeoff, it has a lot of power and a little bit of aircraft. And landing and takeoff, you need to respect that. But once you get it up and moving, it's a pretty easy aircraft to fly, although you do have to keep an eye on your power plant and make sure that you're giving it the proper care and feeding. And there's a lot of buttons and switches in the cockpit that you're going to have to memorize and figure out what you want bound where. I'm looking forward to doing a bunch more videos on the Mosquito, including exploring its history as really the very first multi-role aircraft. It flew sorties, combat sorties from 30 feet in altitude to 30,000 feet. And I really think that there's some really interesting stuff there, so I'm looking forward to exploring that in some future videos, as well as testing it as the iron bomber that it loves to be. So, for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.